All right. I'm gonna keep it short because pretty tired. I think we're all pretty tired. But yeah, I really enjoyed the discussions. So the first thing I wanted to clarify is what we mean by subjective here. So when I ask the question, is our experience necessarily subjective? I think it is good to probably distinguish two senses of subjective here. One we could say that is a more of a weak sense where we're talking about first person perspective. What is like this, or what, as Robert mentioned, the way Zahavi puts it, what it's like for meanness. Right? And then there's a strong sense of saying that experience is subjective, is to say that it without the sense-giving subject, there would be no experience at all. That's the Husserlian sense, right? And he ends up taking up a transcendental idealist position. So what I'm questioning is the second sense, the strong sense, right? When we say is our experience necessarily subjective, I'm questioning whether our experience necessarily have to have a sense-giving subject. Don't we have experiences where this sense-giving subject is not there? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about Nishida and how he talks about this place. So the question would be, I'm not denying that there is a weak sense of first person perspective. Obviously, being a phenomenologist, I want to say that, as long as we're talking about experience, there is a first person perspective. The question is, what might be the perspective of the place, right? And is this place an alternative conception of a subject self, or subjectivity, or is it something else altogether? That's a bit of an open question. I'm not sure myself. Nishida himself would talk about a true self, coming from a Zen Buddhist background, distinguish it from a normal sense of self. That's more related to an ego, kind of. But yeah, when I talk about place, I prefer, I think, to stay away from all these S terms, just because of the connotation it has for us. Another way of asking this question is, so Zahavi again talks about what it is like for meanness. Well, what is the nature of this me, right? I think for Zahavi, this me is the sense-giving subject, right? It's this transcendental subjectivity that constitutes meaning in the world. Now, I don't want to deny that there is some sort of for meanness, but this me, is it really this sense-giving subject, or is it something else? Okay. Are you kind of okay with this distinction that I made? All right, so this is the last part that I wanted to talk about the end of the lecture, at the first part. So Nishida Kitaro is the founder of the Kyoto school tradition. He is recognized as the first modern Japanese philosopher. So Japan opened up in the Meiji period to the West, or was kind of forced to open up to the West. And during that time, a lot of the ideas were imported. Western philosophy was imported. There are a lot of scholars who were mostly engaging in translating the text and introducing Western ideas, but not much original philosophy came out of that. And so the reason why Nishida is called the first modern Japanese philosopher is because he did something very original. Namely, he tried to fuse Eastern philosophy and specifically Zen Buddhism, even though he's also drawing on other Eastern sources as well, like Confucianism and Taoism, amongst other, and also other brands of Buddhism. But the main one I would say is Zen Buddhist thought. And he tried to fuse Eastern philosophy with Western philosophy. And this was very original because Zen Buddhism puts a focus on non-thinking, not thinking, right? Stop reflecting, right? And that's like the other end of Western philosophy, which puts an emphasis on reflection. So putting these together is quite paradoxical, which makes Nishida's philosophy extremely difficult to understand. But putting that aside, he was critical of Husserlian phenomenology for its emphasis on intentionality, namely this directionality. Yet, I think, so that's why people normally wouldn't call Nishida a phenomenologist, but I think we can still safely say that he's a phenomenologist in spirit, namely because he really wants to try to stay with our experience. It's constantly just going back to experience. So as with Husserl, Nishida was interested in studying what is directly given to us in our experience. And he also believed that in order to access this direct experience, we need to take certain measures. Namely, we're not usually accessing direct experience. There are some, we are putting on various filters. We need to get rid of these filters, right? So for Husserl, that method for us to secure this field of phenomena was the epoche, right? Suspension of judgment. Instead of suspending judgment like Husserl, what Nishida did was he suspended reflection. So suspension of judgment is a philosophical tool, right? It's part of philosophical reflection. It's still a difficult thing to do, right? Like we try to do. It takes practice, but it's still part of reflection. Suspension of reflection is quite radical in that it's the suspension of the very means of doing philosophy. So we have this paradoxical invitation by a philosopher to stop reflecting. It's extremely odd. So for Nishida, direct experience is not only prior to reflection, but it's also beyond it. It's beyond reflection. So how can we have access to such an experience through reflection? As a philosopher, he wasn't just content in having that sort of experience. He himself meditated. He was very much in touch with this kind of direct experience. But as a philosopher, he wasn't satisfied with just having that sort of experience. He wanted to philosophically reflect on this kind of direct experience. So how can we philosophically articulate such a direct, non-reflective experience? And Nishida's answer was, well, by suspending reflection. So when we reflect on our experience, what we're doing is we're necessarily bifurcating, introducing a bifurcation, right? So when we see the flower, there's this initial experience of seeing the flower. When we reflect on that experience, you say, I am seeing the flower, right? There is the I, subject, that's seeing the flower, the object, right? And the thing is, the power of reflection is that it tends to interpret the initial experience of seeing the flower as already having the subject-object distinction, right? That's the power of reflection. We tend to think, especially philosophers tend to do this, we tend to think because when we reflect, there is this distinction, that initial experience must already have had that duality, dual structure. But this is questionable, right? Is that really the case? Again, for Husserl, phenomena were always an appearance of something for someone. So when we're talking about an appearance of the flower, it's the appearance of the flower to me, right? There's this directionality, this intentionality. Now, Nishida's suggestion to suspend reflection, when he's suggesting that we need to suspend reflection, he's basically saying we need to suspend intentionality. So he's not just saying that we should stop reflecting, but we should bracket the subject-object distinction of the original experience. So then how do we express this? Okay. Appearance of the flower. That already seems to suggest some sort of distinction between subject and object. How are we to conceptually articulate this? So Nishida called this pure experience, this kind of direct experience prior to the subject-object distinction. He called it pure experience. He borrows the term from William James, but he gives a different interpretation of it in the specific sense of being prior to the subject-object distinction. To give you a sense of what this pure experience might be like, he gives in his first book, An Inquiry into the Good, he gives an example of how when one is really focused on climbing a cliff, there's no sense of me climbing the cliff. There's no real kind of, you're just in the zone, you say, right? Or when an expert musician is playing a piece, there's no sense of me playing the music, right? Initially, when you're practicing a piece and you're a novice, there's a clearer sense of you trying to perform a piece of music. But as you become more of an expert, that sense of me starts to dissolve. These are some examples of pure experience. And there's also an example from the aesthetic, which is sort of getting to the realm of religious, I think, spiritual experience. And he says, when I see the flower, I am the flower is me. This obviously doesn't make sense at the kind of normal level where we assume a distinction between a subject and an object. But he's talking about this sort of experience when we're completely absorbed or mesmerized by the beauty of the flower. There is a sense in which you can only say, well, I'm not really here. You might want to express this as saying, I am the flower. You've become the flower. And the flower is me. So in all these examples, the usual sense of the self or agency is gone, right? So I am not doing the climbing, but rather there is just the activity of climbing. Right? I am not playing the music, but rather we could say that music is manifesting through me. Here's an example from Matsuo Basho, the haiku poet, the famous haiku poet. He made a distinction between two types of haiku poetry. One, he called it suruku, literally translated as doing poem, and naruku, which literally translates as becoming poem. And he said that when you're trying to create some sort of anything, but for him, creating a poem, there's initially this strong sense of ego, of wanting to create something good, worthy, valuable, right? So there's a strong sense of wanting to do something, there's a strong sense of a will and a project in mind. When you try to create a poem based on this kind of strong sense of ego, he calls this doing poem. There's a clear sense of doing. Now he says a good piece of poetry doesn't come out of this sort of process. Through a lot of thinking and acquiring of skills, at some point, I think we've all had these moments where at some point, all of that kind of drops off and you just kind of let it go. In those sort of moments, once you let go, paradoxically, something really good comes out. I think we've all experienced this at some point, right? You're writing some article, you're so, you're really trying to, I don't know, you might be stressed with wanting to complete something really good. But then you reach some sort of peak point where you're so stressed that you just kind of let it go. Then once you let it go, as if it was just waiting for the moment to come out, these great ideas come out, right? And yes, it is a result of you going through that process, but there is more of a sense of a spontaneous creation, right? It kind of happened on its own. And this happens by letting go of the will. And Matsuo Basho calls this naruku, a becoming poem. This came to be. That's also an example of pure experience. When you let go, there is a simple kind of unfolding of events, and you're just kind of going with the flow and letting yourself be in tune with the natural unfolding of things. Some examples from the Japanese language. In Japanese, there's a distinction between mizukara and onozukara. Mizukara means according to one's own will. Onozukara means according to a thing's own way of being. You might say naturally. So you might say mizukara omoidasu, which means to actively, based on your own will, remember something. Or you could say onozukara omoidasareru, which is a passive way of speaking, but we would say the memory kind of came to me. It just kind of naturally came to me. The interesting thing is that in English, we would make a clear distinction between these two events, right? Something naturally occurring and something based on one's will. In Japanese, there's a very close connection between these two. And you can see that in the way that they actually employ the same kanji that stands for self, right? It's just a matter of how you read it, right? There's a close connection. There's a sense that the Japanese people, at least in the language, there is a sense that the way things naturally happen and the way that's according to our own will, there's a sort of overlapping. We often also speak of important events in the passive form. For example, when you want to say that I'm getting married, in the very formal sense, the formal way of putting this is この度は結婚する運びとなりました, which literally translated, things have developed such that we have become married. It's such a passive way of talking about important events, right? That's the way you would normally interpret it. But it's this idea that, this sense that it was not so much me bringing about the course of events, but it's just a result of the natural movement of events. And you were just, so you're part of this natural movement events, and you just happen to take part in that. You were lucky enough to take part in this natural movement of events. So there's a sense that we're actually most free, not when we have a strong sense of will that separates us away from the natural unfolding of events, but when we are in tune and when we're acting in accordance with the way nature unfolds. There's a very strong sense that this is coming from the Japanese tradition of how we are part of the natural, of nature, in the sense of there's for everything, there's a way things naturally unfold. So I gave you a few examples of how we might understand pure experience. The question now is, what's the structure of consciousness in pure experience, right? If there is no I, the I in the sense of the strong will or ego, is there no consciousness? So no self, does no self entail no consciousness? Nishida's answer is no. Consciousness, when the ego is gone, consciousness becomes the place. It's the basho, where the subject object takes place. So this comes back to our point with the exercises, when I was trying to get you to get a sense of being this kind of stage upon which, right, the subject object is playing yourself out, right? This idea of the stage is what Nishida means by place. That's when, so what you, by giving up the role of the strong sense of ego, it's not that you disappear. It's not that the perspective disappears. It's just that you become more of the kind of place where all of this is happening. So consciousness as place is not a subject in the usual sense of being opposed to the object. The reason why I don't really like using the word subject is because subject is, it's kind of a relational term to object, right? But place is rather the condition of possibility for the subject-object distinction. It's the third category. And importantly, it itself cannot be objectified. Once you objectify it, it becomes another object or a subject, right? So it cannot be objectified. In that sense, Nishida called it a nothing. This place is a nothing in the sense that it's not a thing, no thing. Called it Muno Basho, the place of absolute nothingness. It was his term. Okay, so just coming back to what I initially started off with, phenomenology in the traditional Husserlian sense provides an arrow-based approach to consciousness, which gives us a kind of common ground with category theory, with its emphasis on relations and the primacy of relations. We quickly looked at hermeneutic phenomenology that provides a more dynamic circular twist to this arrow-based approach. But I think Nishida's phenomenology, we can call it that, provides a place-based approach that effectively moves away from the subject-object framework, or maybe complements it, I'm not sure. Probably complement is better. So we went from, ontologically speaking, substance, which none of us like, to relations, to more dynamic relations, and then to place, the condition of possibility for the subject-object distinction, the place of relations. So these were some of the discussion questions that I came up with. I probably should have put this up earlier, but sorry, I forgot about it. How compatible is this place-based approach with the structural approach to consciousness? I think it's very much compatible, but how might we think? Why is the relation-based or error-based approach not sufficient? What does it add? How compatible is it with category theory? Specifically, I'm interested in the question, what might be the equivalent of place in category theory? While the place-based approach might be philosophically significant, how significant is it really for consciousness studies? In order to assess this, I think the last question, what might we empirically test this place-based approach, might be a good one for us to think about. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful talk and presentation. Actually, the work of Nishida, right?
Yeah.
Reminds me of one colleague of mine, Yuko, who is also like a philosopher, and he studies psychedelics, and also he's a Zen Buddhism practitioner. So he usually says that consciousness is just this moment. And there was this interesting paper which he wrote with Henry Ryle, also one colleague of mine, so saying that basically there is no hard problem, or hard problem can be avoided if you say, or if you take a perspective that, let's say, material reality is conscious experience. So there is no difference between subjective experience and material world, because it's basically the same. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting.
Thank you for this, and it connects to many things that have been discussed today. I am much of a fan of suspending reflection. It's so annoying anyway, but the point of having place as a substitute for the dyadic subject-object relation seems to me to invite this sterility trap. Isn't this suspension of reflection just a limit of all intelligibility? Isn't it a caput mortuum, to use a Hegelian expression, of abstraction, in which, okay, we find this experience as being not even pre-reflective, a-reflective. It is it's a no thing, but then what do we do with that? Is not, in the very fundamental sense of using abstraction, of using structuring to thinking, something like a dyadic thing that's related to a mind, like this inherent intentionality structure, to use this word, isn't this like packed in, and the moment you dissolute this, you have dissoluted intelligibility?
Yeah. So Nishida, again, is a philosopher, right? So at the end of the day, when he talks about pure experience, it is a philosophical concept. He does make a distinction between pure experience as a philosophical concept and the actual experience of it, right? And so he also talks about religious experience philosophically, but that cannot really replace the actual religious experience. But for him, it was important that he attempts to philosophically get close to this idea, to make it a bit more accessible to the people. But at the end of the day, he said that if you really want to know it from the inside, then do it. Right? Sit and meditate.